Good day today. We come back to our text from the Gospel of Mark, the 10th chapter. Today we will be looking primarily at verses 41 through 45 in chapter 10. As you'll remember from the last time we were together in Mark, that two of the inner circle, James and John, came to Jesus and said, Master or Rabbi, teacher, will you do something for us, anything that we want? Basically, an open-ended question that said, we're going to ask you to do something and we want you to agree to it before we ask you. So Jesus says, what is it that you want me to do? And then they say, when you come into your glory, will you let us sit at your right and your left hand? And of course, Jesus explains to them that they don't know what they're asking because they're thinking about Jesus as the Messiah or the Christ as kind of a conquering hero, one like the Roman generals that ride into the city after winning a great battle, acclaimed by everyone on the side of the road. It's a parade-like situation. And when we get to Palm Sunday, eventually, we will notice that Jesus does come in this fashion, but on a lowly little donkey with almost his feet dragging the ground, and it's kind of a humorous situation that we see there with Jesus as the conquering hero. Rather, Jesus puts it in terms of drinking the cup and receiving the baptism. It's the cup and the baptism of suffering, of servanthood, of being a slave to all, someone who humbles himself in this case to be the kind of leader that they don't really understand how a conquering hero can offer servant leadership. And that's what Jesus is talking about. And so he explains all this to them. And our text today begins with what you might call envy or jealousy. It's a very, very human characteristic. We all feel it all the time. Sibling rivalry often is created in this way. If you remember the stories that we were looking at a few weeks ago in Genesis, that the mother has a favorite son, the father has the other son as his favorite, how it causes friction and enmity between the two brothers who fight for generations, actually. So the first sentence should not surprise us, but I'm pretty sure that it disappointed Jesus. Now, at this time, when the other 10 disciples heard about this, that is the question, will you do anything that we ask of you, James and John? When the other 10 disciples heard about this, they became angry with James and John. And that makes certain sense. One group, or a couple of individuals anyway, try to get out in front of the group and get special favors, I guess you could say. Please do for us whatever we ask. And so they've gotten Jesus off by the side, and they're trying to get Jesus to cut kind of a side deal with them. This flies in the face of covenant relationships. In covenant relationships, we like to think of covenant relationships between human beings as being on sort of level ground. Now, obviously, covenant that a parent makes with raising a child is not of this order. But in terms of friendships and other kinds of associations that we have with other people, we like to think that we are all on an equal footing. So the other disciples, when they realize that James and John have sort of gone behind their back and tried to cut a special deal with Jesus, they're angry. This has created a rift among the disciples. So Jesus called them over and said, "You know the ones who are considered the rulers by the Gentiles show off their authority over them, and their high-ranking officials order them around." And what Jesus is doing here is he's comparing and contrasting the way that his community, the early Christians, sometimes called the Way in the Synoptic Gospels, but in the Gospel of the church, which we call the Acts of the Apostles, the Way is what we call the church. Sometimes Matthew calls the church the ecclesia, the church of God, but often it's called the Way. And so what happens here is Jesus is showing how the Romans and the Jewish leadership, the religious authorities, are conspiring against the common peasant people by throwing in with the Romans. They trade off the Romans' authority, which is authorized in many ways by the strength of their military. And Jesus is saying, we don't do it like they do. They lord their authority, the Gentiles, which is anybody that's not Jewish. They lord their authority over their people. They dominate their people. They do everything by force. And what Jesus contrasts is here saying is that in their community of faith, they look at each other as equals and they love one another as Jesus has loved them. Because he says, but that's not the way it will be with you. What that means is my community does not function like the powerful Romans or those who trade off the Roman power, the religious authorities, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scriptural lawyers, and so forth. And then he says, whoever wants to be great among you, and this is what this whole passage is about, sitting on the right and the left hand of Jesus in his glory, shows the greatness. And greatness is often understood in terms of power. Whoever will be great among you will be your servant. This is where servant leadership comes from. This is the leadership that Jesus has demonstrated since essentially he gathered the disciples together and they began to follow him around in and around the Sea of Galilee. So then what he says is, whoever wants to be first among you will be the slave of all. In other words, the greatest among you, the number one, we're number one. We do this in our sporting events and the teams that we follow. Everybody wants to be number one. Jesus says, whoever wants to be first among you will be the slave, doulos, of all. For the human one, or the Son of Man, did not come to be served, but rather to serve and to give his life to liberate many people. Other versions of the Bible say he came to give his life as a ransom for all. And that word ransom has to do with redeeming a slave. In other words, a certain amount of money might be paid, and someone who has been a slave will be released from servitude by the cost of buying the freedom. And oftentimes that is called a ransom. So Jesus here is alluding forward to what will happen on the cross, the resurrection, and the ascension, that is all brought about by God, that Jesus' life will become a substitutionary atonement for all people, all the people's sin. And the wages of sin, of course, as Paul tells us, is death. And so Jesus, by his life of servitude and by his surrender of his life for the many, or as a ransom, will become the Savior of the world. And that finishes what we started earlier in the week with the text Mark 10:35 through 43. It's a very important text. It tells us a lot about who the disciples are. It also tells us what kinds of things that the disciples would ask Jesus to do for them. So I will see you next week, and I'm glad you joined us today.